Hello. Thanks a Hello everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me to present at the Healthcare and Life Sciences Symposium at the Knowledge Graph Conference. My name is Maulik Kamdar, and today I'm going to present on web scale data integration in life sciences and healthcare through knowledge graphs. I have another talk also scheduled for the main conference, and this talk is a slight variation from the other talk. Before we begin, I just wanted to disclose that I am the Director of Clinical Informatics at Optum UHG. However, this presentation is more on a broader review talk on the potential applications and challenges for knowledge graphs in healthcare and life sciences, and I'm not going to talk anything specific about what we are doing at Optum. I'm going to pause here for like 5 seconds so that you could have time to read on the screen this particular saying. So there's been a lot of research in this. A lot of estimates around the doubling time of biomedical knowledge, and it is often estimated that in 1950 the doubling time was 50 years, in 1980 7 years, in 2010 3.5 years, in 2020 just 73 days. And I would like to go further, saying that in as we move into 2023, this doubling time is continuously decreasing because of the deluge of data and knowledge that is being published after the COVID-19 pandemic. So, biomedical knowledge is expanding faster than the ability of professionals to aggregate, assimilate, and apply it effectively during clinical education, patient care, and research. And this knowledge still is like predominantly published through unstructured formats like scientific publications, preprints, clinical trials, medical textbooks, flowcharts, guidelines, etc. There's a lot of different structured knowledge sources as well, such as drug targets, biochemical pathways, epidemiology knowledge, etc. But in biomedicine, there is also a huge explosion of data as well. So there's a lot of biological data, such as genomics data, proteomics data, metabolomics, pharmacological data that is being published out in the wild. There's a lot of patient data, both public and enterprise patient data, such as lab tests, comorbidities, diagnosis, administered drugs, image scans. A lot of sensor data, such as physiological, wearable activity, environmental, social media, etc, and other sources of data such as chemical data, socioeconomic determinants of health. And I'm not trying to be exhaustive here, but there's a lot of data that is being published along with a lot of knowledge that is published in biomedicine. And oftentimes, whether it's patient care, clinical education, or biomedical research, a lot of time different sources of data need to be analyzed and integrated simultaneously in conjunction with all the available knowledge. So it causes a lot of challenges for current biomedical researchers and clinicians to interpret data in conjunction with the available knowledge. So that's my talk going to be. I'm going to talk about the knowledge graph ecosystem. I'm going to talk about some of the tools, techniques, and methods. I'm going to give a brief overview on some of the applications for knowledge graph, some of the applications where I worked on, and some of the challenges and opportunities with like leveraging knowledge graphs to tackle data integration challenges in healthcare and life sciences. So just to give a brief context, why do we care about knowledge graphs? So biomedical data and knowledge can be best represented as an interconnected graph. You can have like a relation that between two different entities like rheumatoid arthritis and methotrexate. You could add more context saying that rheumatoid arthritis is a type of a disease, methotrexate is a type of a drug, and the relation between them is a type of has drug relation. And you could start incorporating inheritance and transitivity. You could say Felty syndrome is a type of rheumatoid arthritis, and you can start incorporating provenance around the different entities and relations. So you can say that rheumatoid arthritis has drug methotrexate is actually mentioned in this Journal of Arthritis and Rheumatology, where there is a chapter called Treating Rheumatoid Arthritis with MTX. And you can start bringing in more and more data associated with this particular in this particular graph. You can have like patient data around, like say for example, you have a patient that has a condition of Felty syndrome, has some prescription which might be a brand for methotrexate, And you can think about starting integrating a lot of different sources of data. You could start bringing in the comorbidities associated with the particular patient, their history, their environmental data. You could try to bring the different genes and pathways associated with rheumatoid arthritis, as well as the proteins that are encoded by those genes, and the different drugs that may target those proteins. You could start to bring different side effects or drug-drug interactions that are associated with a given drug. And so, as you can see, this can be an explosive graph, and like knowledge graphs is like the most suitable means of representing this information. And a key thing to note, this data and knowledge is continuously changing. So the relations between the different biomedical entities are continuously changing. Patient data may be continuously changing. You might have a lot of different experimental data that is being poured in, which is continuously changing. So it becomes a very complex problem. And I think knowledge graphs are a great solution for tackling those challenges in biomedicine. But a key thing to note here is that biomedical AI has been your way earlier. So you may think about that 2010 onwards is the era of knowledge graphs with the Google knowledge graph and a lot of different companies mentioning that they're using knowledge graphs in some form or the other. But you could like go back in time and you could like say there are several different implementation of knowledge, domain specific knowledge, implicit and flexible encoding of knowledge, trying to bring in multiple sources of knowledge, handling standardization and interoperability, as well as allowing expert systems to have some kind of explanations and reasoning mechanisms. So as you can see, there are a lot of different tools and technologies and standards that have been on this like pathway that is leading up to knowledge graphs. And some of these are still widely used, like HL7, UMLS semantic network, gene ontology, etc. So what is different now? And so it means to think that not only should we just be focused about the knowledge graph, but we must be focused about the wider ecosystem of things, which I am calling your knowledge graph ecosystem, which is composed of several different tools, techniques, and methods. And there's a lot of development in all these different tools, techniques, and methods, which makes knowledge graphs a bit more exciting compared to some of the older versions of semantic networks and knowledge-based expert systems. Um, and and one thing to note is like if you're developing enterprise knowledge graphs, it's always key to focus on like what are the applications. Like it's always good to keep a constant eye on the use cases associated with those knowledge graphs. A lot of time when people develop knowledge graphs within enterprises, it's like there's sometimes this mentality that we'll build a knowledge graph and people will come to use that knowledge graph, and oftentimes that is not the case. So it's always good to like keep a constant eye out on the use cases when you are trying to build a knowledge graph. And that would involve once you have those idea of those use cases, that would involve like identifying what are the relevant data and knowledge sources that you need to build out the knowledge graph. This could include popular sources such as SNOMED, ICD-10, UMLS, UniProt, etc. But it could also mean public or enterprise unstructured or structured sources like scientific papers or gene expression data sets. And then obviously there's private secure sources, which are like patient records or search and browsing history, as well as some other sources like common vernacular or slang terms, etc. if your use cases in search or recommendation and things. And once you have identified those sources, and once you're still keeping an eye out on the use cases, you can think about the different ways you could start to build out the knowledge graph. And this can include some of the classical approaches such as ETL pipelines, or like virtual integration approaches like data federation. OMOP is coming up as a great standard for like querying different sources without actually trying to aggregate it into a warehouse. Fire. And also there's a lot of like there's a lot of development in automated knowledge extraction using machine learning and NLP approaches to automatically extract, identify, like, say, for example, topics around a particular snippet of text, or like, say, automatically classify hierarchies out of like different concepts of biomedicine. And similarly, identify relations. For example, this particular snippet of text is saying that conjunctivitis has clinical finding red eye, and you could also associate evidence associated. Like, so for example, you could have the snippet that I'm showing here associated with that particular relation as an evidence statement for this relation in the graph. Once you have identified your different extraction and integration methods, you could start thinking about how are you going to store them? What are the types of knowledge graphs that you're going to use? And there are several different options for scalable graph database vendors. And I don't want to go into a debate about whether you should use a labeled property graph or an RDF triple store. Just keep an eye out on the use cases that you want to target. And because we are talking about biomedicine, healthcare, and life sciences, that's very vital that the knowledge inside the graph is like manually vetted, curated by knowledge experts on a regular basis. And you need to provide tools which make it easy for subject matter experts who are familiar with the domain itself, but they might not be familiar with graph-based representation technologies. So these could include terminology and ontology editors. This could include visualization platforms that can visualize the entirety of the knowledge graph in some interactive way. Or this could include visual query systems, which allows the users to not formulate, say, Sparkle or Cipher queries, but like intuitively and interactively formulate queries, which can then go across the knowledge graphs and get them the right data or knowledge that they're browsing. And finally, it's also very important to provide developer-friendly API services on top of the knowledge graph. Oftentimes, like when folks develop enterprise knowledge graphs, it's always like, oh, people will use Sparkle queries or Cipher queries. It's very difficult for folks who are familiar with, like, say, search or recommendation or decision support, who are familiar with like their technologies, to actually also start taking on graph query language or graph representation methods. So having developer-friendly API services like REST or JSON-LD or HCM and Fire API service would definitely be beneficial for other application developers to consume knowledge from the graph. And finally, you might also want to bring in contextual data that is not that cannot be stored within the knowledge graph in some fashion, either due to privacy reason, either due to security reasons, either due to just like reducing the data duplication, things like that. And this is an iterative process. So like as new applications and requirements emerge, it's like very vital to like continuously iterate into this particular ecosystem and like continuously identify new sources, continuously identify new methods for extraction and integration. Oftentimes there's been this notion that like once the knowledge graph is built, it's like stable in time. It's not stable in time. It continuously needs to be iterated and refined even as new applications and requirements emerge. So with that, I would like to segue into some of the applications for knowledge graphs in life sciences and healthcare. And once again, just like this is a broader review talk about what can be potentially done, what I have been involved in the past. So one of the first and easiest application that oftentimes folks think where knowledge graphs can be applied is like improving search. And so, for example, in biomedicine, you can think about like document search, where you want to retrieve precise, updated, trustworthy information from documents for short queries. So like here you have a clinician who is treating a particular patient, and they want to like look up like certain short queries like clindamycin for skin infection, or temozolomide dosage for someone with MGMT methylation. And so these are very concise, focused queries that need to be interpreted to get the right document at the point of care when a clinician is treating a patient. So it requires a lot of query intent interpretation, query parsing, spell check identification, things like that. And I talked a lot about this in my previous talks at the Knowledge Graph conference. So like I would not spend that much time on this. Similarly, you could think about document recommendation as another use case, where like a clinician is browsing, say, a document on glioblastoma multiforme 4, and like you could like try to identify related documents like a clinical trial that has just been published, or a clinical calculator associated with that particular document, things like that. But then you can start thinking about like more bringing in contextual information around a particular patient or a particular clinician as they are searching and browsing information. So you could think about a personalized search and recommendations, where you could use contextual information in a privacy-first approach. And finally, you could start thinking about more complex search. Like, so you start with very simple search and you start with thinking about more complex search, like question answering. Like, if I am a biomedical researcher and I have a query like, what are the medications prescribed to melanoma patients that have mutations in their BREF gene, you need to parse the key classes, the key entities, the key relations that need to be extracted from this natural language query, and try to identify the right data set that you could retrieve for that particular information query. And similarly, on another note, you could think about knowledge graphs and their applications for like pathways and predictions. So, discovery and drug repurposing is a great field right now, where a lot of researchers are exploring the use cases of knowledge graphs. Where, for example, you could use a knowledge graph to search the space of all potential ligands and drugs and proteins for prediction and docking models. So you search the space of all the potential ligands, identify the 3D molecular structures associated with those particular ligands that meet your criteria, and then run it through a protein docking model. And similarly, you could think about pharmacovigilance and drug safety. This is something that I have worked in the past, where you want to integrate a lot of drug and protein interaction networks to predict adverse reactions. And this becomes a combinatorial space, because multiple drugs may interact with the same protein, and different proteins may interact with other proteins in a particular pathway, who have their own drugs and things. So it can lead to a lot of like adverse reactions, and a lot of patients are on multiple drugs right now. So polypharmacy is a big issue within the United States. You can think about clinical decision supports, where you can use knowledge-driven clinical pathways for predicting the next steps in a patient's journey. So this can include differential diagnosis, predicting the prescriptions that a patient should take, depending on their history, things like that. And finally, you may just want to like think about bringing all the information that we know about, providing it in a summarized way through interactive dashboards, or for other use in other prediction models. This is some of the work that we have done in the past, like around opioid epidemic, as well as the Ebola virus disease, where I was a part of the group where we brought in all the information that is relevant for both these diseases, and then used that information to develop nice visualization dashboards for other biomedical researchers to use, as well as for like developing clinical prediction models. And so, while the applications are cool, like from a knowledge graph perspective, as I mentioned, like if you want to work in like an enterprise system, like you might want to think about like how to start developing API services on top of the knowledge graphs that can power all these different applications. And so this can be API services that can deal with like the unstructured document level information, like that can provide, like, say, for example, semantic annotation, topic identification, perform document similarity and things. Or you could also do entity linking and normalization using the entities within a knowledge graph, as well as provide schema mappings. But if you are thinking about a search use case, you could, like, as I mentioned, think about a knowledge graph that can power, that can improve query parsing, or that can do spell checking, or that can do query expansion by identifying similar concepts. And you could think about a knowledge graph powered API services that can do pathway inference. The use case that I mentioned about clinical decision support, where you try to predict the next when you try to predict the next step, or the differential diagnosis of a patient, or predict a medication that a patient should take, or like pharmacovigilance, like try to predict drug adverse reaction and things. And finally, you could also think about having knowledge graphs send like 3D structures to, like, say, ML prediction and clustering models, or 3D docking models. There's a lot of API services that need to be developed when you're thinking about like taking a knowledge graph to use within production. And while this is all exciting, I wanted to like end my last 5 minutes on some of the challenges and opportunities in this particular space of like leveraging knowledge graphs within healthcare and life sciences. First of all, this is a very common diagram that like you might have often seen in several knowledge graph talks. Like, but this is very vital in healthcare and life sciences. And if you're developing scalable biomedical knowledge graph platforms, you need to ensure that the knowledge in a graph is continuously fresh, like, because it is continuously evolving and expanding with new research and discovery. So you need to think about automation associated with the knowledge graph. Similarly, the knowledge in a biomedical knowledge graph needs to be trusted and accurate for use in different products. And finally, the knowledge in a graph can arise from several different heterogeneous sources. So think about automation, think about like the different pipelines that you would try to bring in to develop your knowledge graph. And if you think about automated ML and NLP for extracting knowledge, there's still a lot of issues. Like so, this is and so bear in mind that this is an example from 2020, so it's a bit old. Like we didn't use like the more modern transformer based models, but like given this particular snippet of text, like say status asthmaticus or acute severe asthma is a refractory state that does not respond to standard therapy such as inhaled beta agonist or subcutaneous epinephrine. So can you infer acute severe asthma has drug epinephrine? No, you can't. But can you infer asthma has drug epinephrine? Maybe, if you think acute severe asthma is a type of asthma. Similarly, you have a lot of like contextual information associated in medical text. Like early retrospective studies suggested that reserpine was associated with breast cancer, but prospective studies and meta-analysis of case control studies have shown only a weak association. Here you cannot infer breast cancer has drug reserpine, but like sometimes NLP models might actually infer this particular relation from a text. Um, Once again, as I mentioned, like this was done using a glove embedding model. So like NLP is getting way more advanced with the advent of GPT-based models. So there are cases where this might be a bit more improved now, but it's still true in the case of knowledge extraction. Um, and so an option could be to just store the provenance and confidence metrics directly within the graph and then threshold on those metrics or combine on the metrics for use of the knowledge in different applications. And a human in the loop can decide depending on the use case and the risk. For search, maybe this might be good. For clinical decision support, don't use those relations, things like that. And there's like another set of challenges which are associated with like say representation, storage, and querying. Like oftentimes you might want to use like say a personalized prediction model where you've got a search session where the user is searching in a sequential manner on these different terms, and you want to like classify different search sessions based on using some say graph convolutional neural network model. So like you want to incorporate this information in the graph and then run some graph model neural network model. How would you represent like temporal information of thousands and thousands and millions of users, in fact, is a challenge. Similarly, there's a challenge of representing like probabilistic information, like say confidence are associated with like this measurement of like this patient John Doe who has a heart rate of like say 100 beats per minute. And finally, in decision support, you might want to identify patients who have diabetes mellitus. I don't care about a specific ICD-10 or a SNOMED CD code. Like oftentimes folks focus on like value sets or like group set of concepts used to represent and reason over that particular information. But how do you represent this grouped set of concepts within the knowledge graph is definitely a challenge. And you might say, you can use reification, or you can use RDF star or Sparkle star or label property graphs or hypergraph formalisms. It's still a challenge, and it's not like directly out of the box for a lot of users. And another thing to be worrying about is like you might end up with like data copies and redundant duplication across the enterprise with knowledge graphs. So it's very vital to think about all those issues. And finally, I think all those challenges are technical challenges that can be there are solutions out there, there's opportunities. I think the big challenge with the adoption of enterprise knowledge graphs is the social factors. When you're thinking about knowledge graphs, there is a lot of stakeholders involved within an enterprise. So you could think about knowledge representation specialists, enterprise architects, external collaborators, international stakeholders, business developers, product owners, scientists, technology developers, medical informaticists. A lot of stakeholder buy-in is needed for the development, quality assurance, maintenance, and adoption of knowledge graphs in business products. And knowledge graphs can be made tangible. As I mentioned, set up a lot of user-friendly visualization interface and developer-friendly API services that are focused on the business use cases, which can enable the knowledge graph stakeholders who are not familiar with Sparkle or Cypher or RDF to like actually interact with the graph and like try to get an understanding of how the graph can be used in their applications. And so with that, I would like to end my talk. Knowledge graphs provide unique opportunities for like web scale computation, integration, and retrieval. I hope I have convinced you with that. There are a lot of different use cases around personalized search, recommendation, decision support. polypharmacy, drug discovery, repurposing, etc. And I'm very excited about knowledge graphs, and I think that they have a potential to drive biomedical AI innovation in 21st century. And I hope I've convinced you after this particular talk as well. And there are still some challenges, but I also think there's opportunities with knowledge graphs to explore all these different challenges. And with that, I would like to end my talk for questions, and I hope you still attend my main conference talk on Wednesday.
Can Malik hear me? Yeah. Hey, Malik, can you hear me?
Hey, yes.
So you had one particular slide, the social part of
Mhm,
knowledge graphs. So given that your work has been largely based on ways to let people interact with them, can you
mhm.
share your thoughts on how the ability to have these stakeholders, the social component of the knowledge graph, interact with the graph accelerates or facilitates or maybe even hampers? I don't know. Can you give us your thoughts on how letting them interact with the knowledge graph changes the design and the construction of these graphs?
That's a good question. Yeah, I've worked on like not only the visualization platforms, but also like having like terminology editing or ontology editing, as well as like visual query systems. Um, it's a delicate balance. Like I personally think that uh, we do need more investment in training in say user experience methodologies, as well as like user interface development, to make the knowledge graphs tangible for folks who are not familiar with like graph technologies. But oftentimes I've also seen that when you put like a simplistic user interface on top of the graph, like folks are like, okay, how is this different from like just using a relational database at the end? Like they don't understand like this is like actually in the back end there's like a huge complex graph query which may or may not be interacting with several different graph resources at the same time using say query federation and things. So it's a delicate balance. I think once you start different stakeholders excited about a graph, you can start like bringing in more and more complex things about like say there's reification involved, there is query federation involved, and this is how it's like under the hood, this is what is going on. But I think in the beginning it's just like a simple step where you just provide like a way to just like explore like the hierarchy or like have a graph visualization on top of it.
Hi, Malik. My name is Gopal. Thanks very much for outlining the future where knowledge graphs could go in healthcare. As a clinician, what I find most troubling is we document for documentation's sake. It's very low utility data that we find very difficult to extract in a patient, particularly over a patient's journey, their timeline. Do you have examples of where precision or personalized care has worked, where we can actually graph the knowledge in a way for utility? Or if not, what do you think is the greatest single hurdle to bringing that kind of precision personalized care?
That's a great question. uh, from an academic setting, like I've seen several different examples, but something that is uh, that that is to paraphrase your question better, like there's a lot of scope for using knowledge graphs for personalized decision support associated with a particular patient, because uh, you can bring in like information around the like the comorbidities, allergies, medications associated with a given patient, and then use that information to like analyze in the context of uh, like a particular clinical guideline that can say that what is the best medication to recommend, what are the potential adverse reactions given the patient history with other medications and things. There is potential in of knowledge graphs in applications there, but from taking from just a simple prototype into actual production where it is actually impacting care for thousands and millions of patients and helping different clinicians, you need to start thinking about how and what models that are currently in place, and like how to send that information back that can be directly embedded within the electronic health record system, that does not affect that does not create alert fatigue, for example, for clinicians. And so there are some standards that are coming out from the HL7 community, the health level 7 community, where folks are thinking about using CPG on Fire and Smart on Fire, where you could represent a clinical practice guideline and all the different decision steps within that particular guideline that can take into account the different patient specificities like medications, recommendations, etc., and provide a personalized recommendation for that patient. That is where I think knowledge graphs can be useful. Like that is where the slide that I mentioned about like the grouped set of concepts, like identifying whether a patient has diabetes, if they have, whether they have other comorbidities, allergies, and things. That's a very there's a potential venue of like how knowledge graphs can help in that context there.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much. You can start us off.
Hi everyone, we're excited to be here with you today, and we are going to be walking you through ZS Kepler, our knowledge engineering platform for linking entities and relationships. Okay, so just some quick background on ourselves. I'm Ashley Port. I am an engineering specialist with ZS Associates in our Architecture and Engineering Expertise Center. My background is in information science, but I've been a practicing ontologist and knowledge engineer for the past 6 years. Jaipal?
Hey everyone, I'm Jaipal. I'm part of ZS's technology practice and been operating in the semantic space for the last few years now, and helped a lot of clients build out our semantic products as well as data fabrics. I'm really passionate about this technology, and I guess everybody who's made it here is, and that's what we'll talk about today on how we can take unstructured data to the next level through knowledge graphs. All right, so there are many problems people brought up. I think the presentation before this, we also talked about the fact that there are many genes and diseases. It's still hard to figure out who has done what research. There's like hundreds of information or millions of information that's hidden in research papers that needs to be unlocked. Why is it hard to unlock that kind of information? So this question started coming up to us from multiple clients, right? Which talked about, look, this is a problem area we're looking into. People from manufacturing reached out talking about that predictive maintenance is a huge problem. Whenever any machine goes down or whenever a bioreactor is about to give out, we need to comb through hundreds and thousands of manuals to look for solutions, to figure out where parts are coming from, who made them, how do you fix them. And the more people spoke to us, the more we saw that they were thinking in terms of causal relationships and graphs, which helped us think about our solution, right, in this particular space. And going through these documentation, be it research papers or even be it manuals, we figured we are trying to get machines to derive insights from documents that were written by humans for humans, right? So even though humans are creating these documents, we write them as a person, and then we're trying to get machines to interpret them and understand them. So we said, okay, how do you solve this problem, right? How do you provide structure? So we don't need to sell the concept of a knowledge graph to this group, but we said a knowledge graph will provide you structure and AI will provide us scale. There are thousands of tools that are getting developed. In GPT was mentioned. There's BioBird, right? So our thinking behind creating a structured solution in the knowledge graph or knowledge engineering space was go off and chase a paradigm that people already know and people are already familiar with, but it gives a developer and a developing team a freedom to operate. So we said AWS as a paradigm exists. AWS provides you a service for networking. It provides you a service for databases. So you know exactly where you want to go to do a particular task, right? And we said let's follow that paradigm. And let's say we have, how do we develop a common set of reusable components that help us focus on data engineering, unstructured data ingestion, linking ontologies to your physical data, and start building out assets in that particular space. So what we'll do today as part of this presentation is actually walk you through and show you a demo of, let's say if you had to build these out as reusable components, what would they actually physically look like? Yeah, so for us, right?
So the platform that we've developed is really organized around several categories of components and services. So the first are our data ingestion assets. These are focused on both traditional data engineering aspects that you need, extraction, transformation, data preprocessing, and intermediate storage, as well as the NLP framework for our unstructured text processing and knowledge mining. Of course, this is a platform for knowledge graph construction, so the core component are the knowledge graph utilities and ontology assets that power that. And we also realized that with any use case that involves a lot of unstructured data, typically benefits from some curation. So building in annotation, provenance, and lineage, and thinking about integration with annotation tools like Label Studio is a key part of the design. Lastly, as the last presenter also noted, knowledge graph is really only as useful as the interface is provided. So whether that's programmatic or visual. So we also have modules like Elasticsearch-based semantic search meant to enable downstream applications to consume from the graph and power some of their capabilities. All right, so we now have a brief demo that will walk you through and kind of show you some of those components.
Yeah, so in today's demo, we'll focus on the middle block, right, where we have our common components to enable data ingestion. And what we'll do is we'll go through a document or a research paper that somebody has published on PubMed and take you all the way through how you would have created in the knowledge graph, right, for a particular use case. The use case we are looking at today is medical insights. Like, let's say if people are interested in figuring out how and what other trials and research has been done in a particular biomarker space or a particular product space, how would you go about finding that information? So as Ashley mentioned, we have several components. The first thing that we're interested in is a common data ingestion framework. So let's say if you take this particular article from PubMed where there are many things that are of interest to us, right? So you have a title so that you know exactly what people are looking into, what biomarkers are being looked at, as well as what is the disease area or a therapy area, right? So you've got, let's say, non-small cell lung cancer is a topic of interest in this particular paper. There are many authors, sometimes specific authors are interest to you, and you have an abstract and you have content here, right? So in this, the video has restarted, but in this space, right? So looking at this PubMed paper, you see, okay, I have a ton of information of interest. How do I structurally extract all the entities and relationships I'm interested in? And I also have figures, tables, and charts that are part of this particular diagram, right? So you need to be able to extract things like topics, authors, diagrams, tables, charts, and then start linking them to each other to derive insights. So the first thing that you take care of is a common ingestion framework. Each of these websites offer you a series of APIs, but you need to be able to scale them and structure them, right? So you need to develop a particular reusable asset which makes, let's say your problem statement is interested in NSCLC, right, non-small cell lung cancer. You should be able to configure and define that, bring me everything that is available from non-small cell lung cancer. So once you pull this information, what do, right? The first thing you do is break it up into sections, right? You start figuring out what sections of data is available and what exactly your paper contains, so that you can start mining your insights and so that you can start mining your entities. So the first thing you see that we have developed a series of adapters for our common data sets like PubMed or AACT, where you can start extracting things like abstracts, sections, and you start seeing things. If you notice this area where I'm highlighting is, let's say there was an image or a table, it would have created pointers to you to say that, okay, there are images, there are tables, there's more information around in the introduction around an author, there is disease areas, and it starts identifying and just simply says the first thing I'll do is sections, right? Why are we doing this? Because one of the first things an NLP engineer does is localization, right? So that you understand what section your components of interest are available in. So you take care of figuring out and tearing your document into various pieces, because eventually you want to get into entities like entities of interest. Entities of interest in this particular document for us were, we wanted to understand the age of the patient population, biomarkers that were being studied in this research paper, drugs, endpoints, ethnicity, because we are trying to look at medical insights, right? What type of trials are being run for in the medical space. So we figured each and every scientific organization has their own way of doing things. So how do you develop a framework where, let's say you're interested in specific entities like age, biomarker, you need to be able to use your own NLP model for each of these. And what this platform enables you is that, you see the picture on the left of the screen, is that a way to identify and define custom modules for every entity of interest. So let's say biomarkers, and GPT is good at identifying biomarkers, right? BioGPT. So you should be able to define that. Let's say I'm interested in biomarkers. Use is there a dependency on any other entity of interest? If not, which section of the document to look into, and then for entity recognition, which particular algorithm to run. So you should be able to define, say, extract biomarkers using GPT, extract endpoints, extract age using a regex, extract bio ethnicity using a regular expression, extract location using a geolocations endpoint. Because in order to get the most accurate insights and the most accurate entities and relationships, you need to be able to give your end users flexibility and customizability, right? So this platform allows you to do that, so that for every document, you're continuously extracting the entities of interest using specific algorithms and keeping a track of where what came from, right? So we'll also show you after this how we keep a track of where which entity was created from, and maintain provenance. So once we run this module which extracts various entities, what is the next thing that that we do, right? So the data scientist doesn't know scale, right? They don't know how to. We don't want to put the burden of figuring out containerizing their models for entity extraction. We figured we shouldn't put the burden of distributing models to the data scientist, right? We want our scientific users to focus on insights. So what this particular tool does, that we advise people who are building a scalable AI solution, is that develop your own way to containerize modules that are being developed by data scientists. So they should be able to plug in their NLP module into a containerization module that allows you to generate the right scale at the right time. So this runs, and this is the module which is taking care of the containerization. Name entity recognition takes care of creating the various components. Second thing that we execute here is standardization, right? Because everybody refers to the same things by different ways. So standardization module is a third component, where you saw in the previous screen that you could configure a biomarker, you configured which algorithm it came from. In the third column on the screen, you also could configure what standardization methodology to use. Your organization might have one, so we tell our clients that use yours, or if there are many public taxonomies or ontologies, we allow you to stitch those as well. So now the same diagram or document that we saw from earlier, right? The same document that we saw from earlier now has a lot more information, if I can get to it, right? So this is the document we saw from earlier, right? Through the extraction module, you were able to extract things like biomarkers that have been enabled, like a power region, or and the entities. You also have a way to exactly tag from which location within the document the entity was extracted out, and what is the type of entity that was extracted. So the same text document starts changing. Right now, you start seeing that I have provenance, that which tells you what text something came from and what is the value of certain components that was extracted. All right, the last thing that we take care of is simply taking the entities of interest, taking the relationships that were extracted, and then loaded into our graph model. For this purpose of this demonstration, we have used Neptune as our graph, and you get a series of TTL files that most people are familiar with. Now, this is the output, right? You start seeing an unreadable graph and an unreadable mess of data that gets created. This is simply linking age, entities, biomarkers, drugs, diseases out of all PubMed documents from NSCLC. So this is a representation of us crawling through around 150,000 documents in the NSCLC space on PubMed. So this is unusable by end users. Users cannot make sense of this. So that's why even in the previous presentation, search was mentioned, right? And what we've done is, let's say you take a simple representation, right? You have two documents, you've got endpoints like progression-free survival, you've got biomarkers that have been represented. This provides you a nice simplified view of search. And the way search has been enabled in this use case was using a UI where we developed this is a UI example of a UI where that was developed on top of this particular knowledge graph. So let's say if you're interested in KRAS, right, which is a biomarker, nowhere the user can simply type in things like KRAS and you start seeing insights that are developed on the basis of research papers, things like graphs, which tells you that how many studies were executed with progression-free survival as an endpoint in the KRAS space, how many studies were executed as a stable disease toxicity. And if you see, nowhere in the search query did we tell them that KRAS is a biomarker. Right? We basically told them that simply using these terms and our knowledge graph, your search was able to map the fact that, yes, you entered a search term. I know through my knowledge graph that this search term is connected to the biomarker ontology, and then that's how you start developing insights on top of it. So we found out that any cases where we've released graphs as is have not gotten much use, but when you're starting to surface end users insights on top of these graphs, these accelerators help you in that particular space.
So we'll now just zoom in a little bit on the different components, just to briefly recap what you saw in the demo. So first, we have the data ingestion framework. This has several subcomponents, one being the data source connectors. So we have pre-built connectors for things like PubMed, for AACT for clinical trials data, but these can easily be extended, and you can plug in connectors for various sources as needs arise. Next, we have configurable processing steps. So these are pre-built configurable steps for things like conducting data quality checks, storing the raw data, parsing images, and storing those with pointers back to the original documents, as well as for pre-processing that data before it goes to the NLP pipeline. And all of this is orchestrated through our Airflow templates so that we can easily scale and configure these pipelines. So next, we have really for any unstructured text use case, the workhorse, which is the unstructured text processing framework. So as you saw, the first step is localization. So this sets the document context, breaks it up into different sections, and the sections can be configured. So if you want to focus on specific sections in order to use different models for those within the extraction part of the pipeline, or you want to have sections where you plan on weighting those differently, perhaps, and how you're going to pull that data into the graph. This is the step where you can configure that list of sections. So next, entity extraction. So as Jaipal mentioned, this is really, we've designed this so that our data scientists can bring their own models. They can easily integrate new models, say that given the explosion in the large language models lately, they can quickly create a new one, test it, and drop it into the pipeline so that it can be run with the same standard output. Then we have the standardization. So many of these extracted entities will need to be normalized either to something that's pre-existing in the graph or to a standard source. Like for different medical indications, you might use MEDRA. And lastly, the relationship extraction. Again, our data scientists bring their own models that they've trained on their data for different types of relationships, and they can run this as part of the pipeline in order to extract those relationships between entities to create the graph out of as well. All of these are the main steps, but these are all meant to be run as part of a pipeline that also does dynamic batching and scaling so that we can parallelize this and be able to run for large amounts of data within reasonable timeframes. So, and lastly, we have our graph generation. The output of the NLP pipeline is standard formatted JSON. So we have utilities to convert that into RDF using configured ontologies. So Typically for each use case, we'll have a domain-specific ontology, whether that's a public one that fits that use case or something that's been developed custom internally. The graph archival step will allow us to archive previous versions so that we can maintain consistency in the graph, and then we load that data. Our default is Amazon Neptune, but we've done this with OntoText GraphDB as well. And in parallel, we have the option of pushing the RDF data also to Elasticsearch to enable the semantic search for our downstream applications as needed. We also maintain versioning information. So we have an internal versioning table we update using the run metadata for each newly inserted entity or relationship or updated resources so that we can maintain version info and lineage throughout the graph. And lastly, as part of the graph and ontology assets, we found that most of our use cases that involve like scientific literature or other documents, the structure and the context of the document is important. Your graph ultimately might be focused around the extracted knowledge and the domain-specific classes and relationships, but you also oftentimes want to be able to go back to that document to be able to look at articles that have been published by the same author or articles in certain publications. And so we want to represent that, and that's not necessarily very specific to a particular use case. That's common across many. So we use we've extended the SPAR document components ontology to be able to represent the documents, the document metadata, the different components, and the annotations so that we can link what's being extracted from the documents to the ultimate instances in the graph. Okay. And so lastly, to just wrap up, really we found that for us, this is enabling our internal use cases to be able to move much faster to implement knowledge graph solutions for different healthcare and life sciences use cases. And it allows our data scientists and engineers to focus more on the knowledge extraction side than the data engineering and graph construction. So this is enabling much faster turnaround time and giving us a lot more standardization and the ability to scale and build on top of something rather than building something from scratch every time. Any last words?
Yeah, usually this is an hour-long demo. This is the first time we've done it this quick.
Hello. Great talk. Thank you. Way back early in your talk, you were talking about the ingest of a particular PubMed article, and I was wondering, you talked about the title, the abstract, but you didn't really mention some of the other more specific metadata. I'm thinking MeSH and some of those other vocabularies. I was curious if that is also ingested, and if not, why?
Yeah,
why
so
not?
we do ingest that. So there's part of it is we're using that metadata like MeSH subject headers oftentimes when we connect to PubMed in order to filter the information we bring in. We might look at, okay, we're going to bring in for this set of subject headings. So that's brought in. And then we do link it. So in the document model, we are capturing some of that metadata as well from the original source.
Thank you. That's excellent work, and you've built some really interesting, frameworks here. But I can't help, coming from the NIH, I can't help but wonder if what this will generate is a lot more graphs that are still completely incompatible with each other. And I'm often looking for ways that we can try to, make it available for people to create graphs that will be able to be connected and made publicly available. Obviously, that's not everyone's plans, but I'm wondering if you've thought about. It sounded like you need to have your clients bring their own NLP and plan their for their own ontology that they want to use for the final graph. Have you thought about trying to at least offer a more general something to your clients to say you could bring your own, or we can use this high level ontological framework that will be compatible with a lot of your your fellow fellow clients, that then you could potentially work together and connect your graphs together, for example.
Yeah, so there, for our clients, we always push them more towards public ontologies versus bringing their own built ontologies, right? So what we are essentially trying to figure out is, again, from members of the Pisto Alliance, right? So fire formats, there are formats around, there's also safety formats, right? So there are a lot of public ontologies that we try to focus the solutions around and build our adapters around. Because without public ontologies, these graphs will not be able to connect to each other, and then and if you don't contribute back to these public ontologies, then the world will no longer, it won't be a true connected data vision, right? So our thought is like, even if with you coming from the NIH also has a lot of good ontologies and taxonomies that they've published. So we strongly reference those. What we are trying to tell folks is that you use high quality or well-defined semantic frameworks that what we'll bring to you, or like what your IT team should focus on is developing scale around it. Right? So our goal is, we'll give you scale, but please follow the public ontologies as much as possible, and respect what your data scientists are doing, because they also know how to extract the right values for the right entities. So that's kind of the whole premise.
Yeah, I think to your point, like, this needs to be coupled with a set of best practices and standards and a knowledge of the available ontologies and how to extend them and leverage them in order to make sure that you can connect that data and it is truly interoperable. Yes.
Any other questions? Complaints? All right, complaints, go for it.
This is really cool work. I really enjoyed your presentation and just the entire work that you've done. I'm from the NovaGraph project, and one piece in our graph that's really critical for humanitarian aid agencies that we partner with is for them to identify experts in our graph. And these experts are primarily in the medical domain, but they also want to find experts who are in the medical domain but have interacted interacted with certain disaster situations, so they can reach out to them in the ground when a disaster happens. And in addition to that, they also want to see information about where that person is located, and also like do they have experience working with, for example, diabetes specific to hurricanes, but hurricanes that happen in this particular region. So those are the kind of use cases that scenarios for that they are looking for, and that's how we model experts in our graph. So very spatiotemporally focused. Like there could be experts. Some of the experts that we primarily extract are experts from semantic scholar publications, and what we've seen is a person who has a lot of publications related to a specific topic no longer is pursuing that work anymore. It's like they're not an expert anymore. So that brings the temporal component into picture, right? So our graph right now has experts that we've extracted from Semantic Scholar, but slowly what our stakeholders are saying is, this is cool, but honestly, we want to see people who've more practically like done or like administered aid in a particular scenario, who most likely have not published scientific articles, right? So have you kind of like tried looking at different sources for your experts besides just PubMed articles? Like, are there other unstructured sources that you've tried to scrape your expertise information from? And if so, can you use the same methodology?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question in two parts, right? The first one is temporal aspect, right? So one of the main reasons we started maintaining our document provenance ontology is that it gives you a time it was published and when the publication was commissioned, right? So that takes care of the time component when you start filtering out entities or relationships of interest by simply filtering out the document that it came from. The second one is pulling out experts, right? So we have looked the same framework we have also utilized on Word documents, because Word documents also have sections, also have areas. We've also pulled out information from PowerPoints for one of our clients, where we looked at extracting entities using the same processing framework for PowerPoint creators and PowerPoint authors, right? So this is just a generic framework. You can use it on various components. The reason we highlighted PubMed and was to simply tell you that you need to have your data ingestion sorted, right? You need to figure out what and some public companies do offer a lot of pre-existing APIs, and this is simply a reuse of PubMed's public API. It's not something that we created to scrape and extract documents. The same type of reusable components Windows also offers for Words. For PowerPoint, you reuse those. You plug it into our containerization modules, which takes care of parallel execution.
Thank you.
All right.
Let's thank Ashley and J. Paul again. And our next speaker is Eric Neumann. And he's going to tell us about hypergraphs.
Everything's up. Do we have a clicker? I think this is it. So thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I wanted to present something. I presented similar kind of slides at the earlier Basel meeting on knowledge graphs. But this goes back really a couple of years. This I go forwards. First of all, a lot of the work that I'm doing currently in knowledge graphs is at MITRE. In just the last couple of months, we've built a knowledge graph around a large-scale genomic clinical study we did around COVID patients. And we're still finishing the paper on that to publish. And the more recent one is working with reviewing NIH's NCATS translator, which is actually quite a monumental piece of knowledge graph work that works across different agents. But my background, and the reason I have an interest in ontologies is, I hate to admit how long ago it was. In 1998, we had the first biontologies conference at ISMB. And this was in Montreal. David Benton, Robin McIntyre, and myself were the guys that started it. And there was really an expectation that the ontologies issue is going to clean up all the data issues that we're seeing with, what's the right format, how do you organize it, what are the models behind it. So we spent, I guess, about the first 10 years, a lot of activity in trying to drill down on them. But they're tricky. And every time we look at one, we see something else about them that needs deeper understanding. It's philosophy dependent. And as a biologist, I'm like, well, everyone thinks like a biologist, right? And they don't. So, are you talking about the data? You're talking about the domain. So these things you can deal with, but they take a long time to sort of settle and argue. And what I'm also seeing in just the last couple of months, the dynamics of something out there like ChatGPT and getting it to write code is really sort of throwing the whole table out. It's going to be an interesting way of how people combine that with ontologies and knowledge graphs and see who tells whom how it's going to be structured. But the other thing is that you can have multiple ontologies that pretty much say the same thing, but they have very different edge relations. And the question is, it's not just about trying to find homologies or alignments between them. There's subtle issues. Part of it is there's so many different ways of getting it right. And I'll talk about the Dedekind number problem later. But property graphs, which are used a lot, I use them. They're very efficient, but they do the one thing that's, most of the time we need to add things to the edges as well as to the objects. They're syntactical sugar, as I think about them. But the more interesting stuff that came out a few years ago is shapes. And shapes is really where I'm starting from in this geometric description, because it really merges 2 or 3 different areas of both computer science and mathematics. So the issue of hypergraphs and hyperedges, if you've been looking around, they're coming up a lot now. There are several papers. There's a very interesting paper on how to represent a lot of domain knowledge using these. Even time series data fits very nicely in a hypergraph kind of model. So I think what I first want to do is sort of present what are hypergraphs. The order is maybe not the perfect thing, but this is just a quick overview of what shapes are. And if you haven't heard of these standards, there's a lot of material you can read on. So both Shackle and Schex describe more or less of a shape or a template that you can use to match patterns that are semantically similar. There was a discussion between these two, the world of math and the world of semantics, back in 2015 between Eric Prudhomme and David Spivak, but it doesn't seem much came of it. Both groups sort of had a chance to talk, and then it was too much. I think the common ground was little, an understanding of this. So unfortunately, I think that would have been a really great topic to settle a lot of the formalisms. But going forwards about this geometric point of view, there are many things that don't quite fit an edge model. And even adding a property sometimes doesn't do that right, because if the thing you want to say about the other two things is itself an object, it gets really tricky, because now you need to say things not about an edge of two things, but an edge of three things, or a hyperedge. And so patient receiving diagnosis from the doctor is in that class. You can try to do it with a skeleton of edges, but there can be so many different ways of doing it just around a simple object of two or three nodes, so that you'd want to talk about the whole shape at once if you could. It comes up also with relations between family members, where it's not just a few that you do a direct composition, it's the whole ensemble that says something. So clearly we have some similarities when we've investigated named graphs, and that's something I'll be bringing up soon. But one thing to really understand is there's two elements that I think are very useful for understanding this. I'm not expecting you to really to learn it here, but you can make notes and then look it up yourself. One is the thought that data is really data in edges, at least. It has to be. It can't be just data points. Whatever data is, it isn't points. It isn't rows in a table. That's a useless thing. That's what's produced Excel sheets full of the company's data that other companies make a lot of money trying to stitch that together again. So it's about objects and edges, and that is mathematically well defined. That's a category. And the things that change one set of objects and edges to another cleanly in a cohesive way is a functor. So without going into too much depth, any database you have, anything, it could be a table database, a graph database, is a functor. It's an instance based on the schema, and it's all these edge mappings that are reified. So that's the thing really, is the functor is not a operator. It's the thing that says, here is everything. Oh, you've got this database. I have a similar database. It's got the schemas that match, but it's from two different experiments. And that's how that's handled. And Shackle and Schex would work the same way. It itself it defines functors within it. So there's more detail. I'll jump ahead here. This gives you the overview of the other piece. The notion behind a hypergraph really is it's built out of smaller exact complexes called simplex, where it could be two things, which is an edge, and we're already in that crowd, or three things at once, and then it's a face, and then higher order. And that's the point, is that you don't have to stop at edges, two edges. You can go higher. But it isn't that everything gets stuck together. In hypergraphs, you'll see you can combine things in various memberships, but there can be meaning associated with each subset. And I'll give you a few. So you can take any existing set of three things that have relations together and bring in a fourth one, either the red one or the purple one, and then attach it. If it attaches to each of the other ones completely, it can form that higher order structure, that simplex. But it doesn't have to attach to all of them. It might attach to two, and therefore it's just going to be an extra set of nodes and edges, but not the full four altogether at once. So simplexes can be decomposed into all the underlying simplexes, and any set of nodes can be put together in complicated ways. It doesn't have to all be a simplex. But if you put them together as a complex of mixed simplices, that's a hypergraph. So you can look at hypergraphs three different ways. Here you have nodes going across the top and edges that I didn't enumerate going down the side. any combination can give you a unique edge in that group. And you can see you can have the entity by itself, you can have things with 2, you can have things with 3, and anyone who knows sort of the power series, this is going to be 2 to the nth. That's the number of possibilities of subsets. And so you can, if you need to, have that many hyperedges. But the other way to visualize it, they're equivalent, is you've got these inclusions, these memberships that overlap in certain places. And if it doesn't look similar, that's good. You're thinking at least how that would relate. But the standard way of looking at hyperedges and simplices is a real boring kind of circular model with wires going across everything. It's so semanticless, it looks terrible. But you can imagine those 3 things say something particular about a protein and its interaction with other factors. This one might go about a set of processes with these proteins that's in a particular part of the cell, and then this here could be the combination of some of those that go between cells. So each one of those colors is a hyperedge. It gets an ID. And just the things it connects to is enough to define the semantics. Just going over back again to looking at hyperedges and properties. Any entity that has multiple properties is basically that main node and the arrows that go off. Now, they connect to simpler things. They connect to sets and numbers and strings, but that's pretty much, it's built out of these stellar sort of structures. But the interesting thing is the edges can have properties, and a property is not just a connection to the edge. Remember, the edge is saying something about the 2 entities. What you have is, for each property on an edge, you've got a 3-way edge, right? It's got to have to refer to both of those things, and then its content, which could be distance, could be strength, but it's not just the edge, it's the inclusion of the nodes on that edge as well. So it's good to think of it as a blade. And so you can build a whole hierarchy of these things. You can give it simple logic, you can give it heavy logic. But basically where we're heading with the nodes and graph story is that it's a larger superset. And you can add any kind of constraints and semantic rules to it as you want. In fact, you need a language to define those. But hypershapes really are a way to sort of deal with larger and larger clusters. Now, the interesting question is, when do you need them? So you can see that I've colored the 3-way relations, I'm keeping it simple, with a triangle color here. The thing that's interesting to note, does this laser really work? All right. I don't know if you're familiar, have you ever seen the RDF definition of how lists work? I mean, that's classic prologue kind of stuff. Jans was very familiar with it. It's about having a first and a rest, and this object breaks to a first and a rest and a first to rest. It just keeps going like that. And a lot of people, including myself, looked at that and says, oh, this is funny. This got turned in the PowerPoint. This purple should be going horizontal, sorry. They'd rather have things indexed, right? The first thing in the array, the second thing, the third thing. I don't see that here. But it turns out when you build this model, these edges can be completed by what we call an indexing set. So you can see from the shaping, you can turn one structure to the next, so they're homologous. So there's a lot of this that comes out of the use of shapes, is that a lot of the crazy structures you'll see in RDF actually can map nicely to very common things that you use in Python and other things. So some examples. So using basically a friend of a friend and a few extra little tricks with named graphs. Oops. I define here a few edges that themselves are entities, they're named graphs, and they consist of, underneath, these subgraphs, which are the nodes. And you can give it, here's the representation of that edge. And you can do the same for each of them, but now you can actually combine them into higher order structures and call that the face, which is really a close trio of people. Now, the real trick, of course, is how would you implement this? You'd like to have some smart, very fast indexing. Once it's indexed, asking about, are you part of this can be very fast. It's an indexing problem, which is the same thing that happened to the linked data world to try to get the data speeds up. So you can do the same trick with higher order graphs. Cellular biology, this is showing, and this comes from work, this is from the paper from Cliff Joslin and Larry Hunter, where you can see multiple ways of dealing with representations. They're all equivalent about the reaction of entities. And you'll notice there's a use of a bipartite graph. So bipartite graphs are a trick to turn anything into a hypergraph, because you can say that these guys are part of this reaction and these two in going out, so there's an overlap between them. So yeah, you can represent hyperedges just with graph elements, but you're going to have a lot of edges, right? You don't want to have to do a sparkle on them. That's going to be a little time consuming. But you can see also that you can represent the whole sort of notion of metabolism with these objects, where instead of trying to write it as all nodes that have these funny relations, the edge itself is now working like a node. So the complex between a substrate and an enzyme is SE, and it's not a node, it's the edge. That includes those 2 points. The same for the product. And then you've got the edge that is really the reaction, the catalytic reaction that goes from substrate to enzyme. Substrate, actually this should be P here, substrate to P in the presence of that. And the shape there now, it's not a dead shape. It actually has an orientation and an action. So this thing takes what was here, turns it to this complex by that action. So you can define processes and things that go over time very nicely with them. If you start to play with the stacking of these, this is edge-oriented. That's what it looks like when you put cascades and composition together. A little bit messy, but it's much more compact when you use just a 3-edge on top of the process. In this case, you're passing the product into the substrate, and here the product itself is the enzyme of the next one. So it's a very, very simple pattern that you could use. You could do queries of all sorts with something of that sort of nature. All right. This is one that I got from Jans when we talked a few months ago on it, and still have been thinking about it. Maybe we'll have a chance to go over this some more. Dealing with transactions, you could have an investment that involves the person getting the money, the investor, the bank, and the location, and turn that into a for object. And if you connect them by what they have common between them, let's say the investor and the bank, they can stitch together, and now this whole ensemble, you can hop between those 4 simplices. Actually, they're called 3 because it's n-1. But you hop now without having to go through as much stuff. You get into one, and you can go over in particular ways. So hopping is a way to make queries more efficient and using rules. So if you have banks that are uncommon, like this one here, let's call it Silicon Valley Bank, you can find the trace of all these things very nicely. So here's something that each of us had to deal with. We come in to molecular biology with all this knowledge, and everyone just asks, but what does the gene do? What disease does it cause? And of course, the gene doesn't cause the disease, but that's what they want associated in this table in a pharmaceutical company. So this is, I remember, a topic that Tom and I at Beyond Genomics went over and over again. So, okay, so this guy, yeah, disease phenotype associated with it, but that's not really what's behind there. What you want to do is, though, take all that knowledge you have about molecular biology and project from it all things. Now, this is my set. Yours is probably very different, but you can see where I was going with it. And then we use the dual trick with saying that if the gene has its own variant, then it does all this in parallel, right? And so this has now got 12 vertices. Maybe you don't want all of them, you want only 4 of those. But that now is an entity that you can describe very simply because you've already agreed on most of these relations. The whole ensemble, even if it's these 3 or going across here and then to here, it's all well defined in that single object. So that named graph has all these other subgraphs within it that you can compose. The problem is when you think about how many combinations you want to go, it turns out to be a really big number. It's not just 2 to the 12th, it's 2 to the 2 to the 12th. And the reason is the membership is for forming one hyperedge, remember? But how many combinations of hyperedges do I want to use for my semantics? Well, how many are there possible? Well, 2 to the 2 to the 12th. And so let's say that the problem of trying to find the right ontologies, the right grouping of edges, that's why we're having trouble. I mean, most of those we throw away, but we're still struggling with the top few, and there are a lot of them. So I think, where this comes from, actually, nice work over 100 years ago by Dedekind, one of the sort of early computer science, actually math logic guys. And what you can see here is if you have just two variables, an A and a B, that are Boolean, it's there, it's not there, you already get 6 different possibilities of how they can be active or not active. This node is an and between A and B, this one's an or, and these are the other partial ones that are under it. It's a classic sort of chaining of these relations. But if you have 3, just 3, it starts to get very hairy. And here's the count. They don't even know what the number is beyond 9. It's too big. So just with 8 objects, you've got all those different logical groupings that are possible. And if you want to capture most of those in semantics, good luck. So there's a problem there. And the idea is maybe we don't try to solve them all. We try to sort of organize these into larger chunks where we have some common agreement, and each of our different ontologies can map on that pretty easily. Then it does the trick. So we can use these hypergraphs and the hyperedges as fiat, as an intermediary for making, So there's a reluctance in this, right? It's taken 20 years to get people to accept graphs in companies. Why throw hypergraphs in them, It's like, good luck. But there's several reasons. The work is starting to happen. People are not as scared as before about these computer representations. And there's issues around AI where one of my interests is using this as an interface between a large language model. And you can see people are already doing not just graph neural networks, but hypergraph neural networks. My feeling also is that the intermediary stuff that comes out of these large language models actually is much easier to compose as a hypergraph than just a graph itself. And that's the kind of stuff I'm experimenting on myself to see if that gives me any advantages. Who knows, maybe that blows up too. But these are the papers behind it if folks are interested. And thank you.
So I have I have a question. I thought it would be simple, but maybe not. So you say that, with hypergraphs, everyone can, you can define your own semantics for it.
Yeah, you could try to bend that. I mean, let's say this: you've got a tetrahedron. You've defined.
Right.
Somebody else has got their tetrahedron or the pentahedron, and you say there's a way to align them.
Yeah, but you still have to interpret each tetrahedron in some consistent way. And my concern is, how many years did it take for us to come up with a consistent interpretation of RDF with just subject, predicate, object?
Well, that was the hard part. So here's the cool thing about what we learned in RDF. We tried to make everything with these edges that were singletons, right? Everything is the same. You have the same relationship for very different instances of nodes. And then we ran into, well, I want to say something a little bit differently. And so we invented named graphs. The minute we opened the floodgates for named graphs, this became sort of easy to do. Because what you can do is any other subpart you can give a name to, and you can say how they assemble. So I think that there was a Jeremy Carroll who did that paper originally on named graphs. There's a way to project that now. That was the hard work, I think. And the actual semantics, there's so many different ways of using and interpreting it, which is going to be necessary. But the structure, I mean, I remember talking to you maybe 2 years ago about using RDF star. to try to define them. And I think there are multiple ways of doing it. We start using named graphs. But I think the hard work for the formatting has been done. Getting to use these things, well, there's research behind that that needs to happen, yeah.
Let me pick up on Jamie's question. So do you think that we can do name graphs in RDF star and achieve what you
I
want
think
to
so.
achieve?
Yeah. I mean, the thing to do is write it and do some inference or query rules on that. That's that, you know, and that shouldn't be that hard. That should be like a couple of weeks of putting together a simple paper. Yeah.
I mean, I think that was a challenge when you started this idea with Jeremy Spivak a couple of years ago, is that the tech wasn't there yet. And so that was what was my concern, was you're going to have to invent an entirely new tech stack.
I don't want to do that.
Yeah. Good.
No. I want to use what's there.
Yeah.
And there might be shortcuts. There might be, you know, syntactically nice things, but they're all consistent. That's the hope. But yeah.
So we've talked about it several times before, right? And I think RDF does all of this already, right? I mean, I talked to you about a bunch of use cases that use hypergraphs, if you interpret them that way, right? And
yeah,
I think you can, I prefer the approach of intermediate objects. So instead of named graphs, you can have intermediate, like the thing you showed that I provided, right? You can just model that with an object that represents its hypergraph.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some very easy ways to represent it and make it work if you have it all consisting of edges. The real trick, the advantage, is instead of having to do individual Sparkle queries and reasoning, you should be able to do higher order jumps. Now, jumping between name graphs is doable, but why would you want to? This gives you a basis of why you want to do it and what you can get out of it. If it's indexed well, it's fast. You know, that for me is really the tough, is the implementation is the trick. But I think, yeah, you can do that just with one of those representations in RDF. It'll work. All right, thank you very much.
All right, and now it's lunchtime. There should be lunch. I have no idea where. Somewhere. Around the corner.
Hi.
We start at 1:30. Yes. All right.
Oh.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.